Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Friday the 13th series with Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Now, this came out in 1984, and this is the fourth film in the Friday the 13th franchise. Now, I already reviewed this along with all the other Friday the 13th films all the way back in 2011 for Season 1 of Horror Month. Those reviews are still up, however, they're no longer public. They're now marked as unlisted, but you can still see them on the Horror Month Season 1 playlist, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. And I recently did new reviews of the first three Friday the 13th movies, which you can see on the playlist for Horror Month Season 13. Now, as you could probably glean from the title, this was intended to be the final film in the franchise. History has proven it wasn't, but it was meant to be. Now, the reason they wanted to lay the series to rest is because the slasher boom of the early 1980s was starting to wind down at this point, and despite the fact that the Friday the 13th movies were insanely successful at the box office, Paramount was always embarrassed by them because these movies actually did not have a very good reputation at the time, at least critically. Like most mainstream critics, and frankly even the executives at Paramount, just looked at these movies as sleazy exploitation films with no artistic merit, and I'm not going to claim the Friday the 13th movies are necessarily artistic, but I think they're a little better than critics at the time gave them credit for. And in recent years, at least these earlier Friday the 13th films have gotten somewhat of a critical reevaluation. Now, Friday the 13th, the final chapter, was directed by Joseph Zito, who prior to this directed films like The Prowler and Blood Rage, and he would go on to direct movies like Missing in Action, Invasion USA, and Red Scorpion. Now, Friday the 13th, the final chapter, has become a fan favorite, and I always used to go back and forth on whether I loved this one or just liked it, but I recently saw this at a drive-in, actually this past Labor Day weekend, and maybe it was just the experience of seeing this at the drive-in, but as I was watching it, I was like, you know what? This is actually a really good slasher film. Now, I'm not going to claim it's a well-written film or it's Oscar caliber by any means, but it's a solid, well-made film for the kind of movie that it is. So, the plot of Friday the 13th, the final chapter, is it picks up directly where Part 3 left off. Now, Part 3 ended where Chris, the main character, shoved an axe into Jason's head, killing him, or so she thought. So, in the beginning of this film, Jason's body is sent to a morgue, and at the morgue, he ends up coming back to life. Now, whether he just happened to survive the blow to the head, or is actually some kind of supernatural being and literally resurrected, is somewhat left up to the viewer's interpretation. But Jason is very much alive, and he kills a doctor and a nurse at the hospital, and then escapes back to the woods by Crystal Lake. The movie jumps ahead to a few days later, and we follow a family called the Jarvises, who live right by Crystal Lake, and we also follow a group of teenagers or young adults who are vacationing at the house right next door to the Jarvises. And basically in the movie, both these groups end up being targets for Jason. Meanwhile, the film also follows the brother of one of Jason's victims, who is going after him for revenge. But ultimately, Jason might meet his match in 12-year-old Tommy Jarvis. Now, one thing that definitely makes Friday the 13th, the final chapter, stand apart from the first three films is this time you don't just have Jason going after a group of horny teenagers. This time you also see him going after a family, which definitely raises the stakes, I think. And the Jarvises are very likable characters. You have Kimberly Beck as Trish, who is essentially our final girl in the movie, even though she's not the one who ends up killing Jason in the end. Now, I'll admit, growing up, I always found Trish to be kind of annoying, but over the years, this character has grown on me. And you have Corey Feldman as Tommy Jarvis, who ends up being the true hero of the movie. Now, this was Corey Feldman's first movie before he did movies like Gremlins or The Goonies. And Tommy Jarvis is a great character, and you can tell he's kinda based on Tom Savini a little bit. The fact that he makes his own masks, and he's really good at makeup. And Tommy Jarvis is also a really funny character, which makes what happens to him at the end, even though he doesn't die at the end, he is severely traumatized by the end of the film, and that does make it all the more sad and tragic. But Corey Feldman is quite good in this movie. You also have Joan Freeman as Tommy and Trish's mother. The movie also features Erich Anderson as Rob, who we learn is actually the brother of Sandra, who is a minor character from Friday the 13th Part 2, who we saw get killed by Jason in that film. So he's now trying to track Jason down, which I thought was a really cool angle to go with, making it almost a revenge/vigilante movie as well. Unfortunately, they don't go all the way with it, and Rob does kind of die like a bitch in the movie. But I liked how the death of a minor character from the second movie ended up having major ramifications for what again was supposed to be the final film of the franchise. Like, it's a nice bit of continuity. Now, sort of a plot hole with the character of Rob that people have pointed out is it almost seems like he's been tracking Jason for years, the way he talks about Jason in the film. Meanwhile, this is only set a few days after the events of Friday the 13th Part 2. But a way I think you can kinda get around that is I assume there was probably some time that passed between when Jason escapes from the hospital in the beginning of the film and then the main events of the film. So like maybe a week or two went by, so I think that's enough time for this guy to figure out who it was who killed his sister and become obsessed and try to track him down for revenge. Yeah, it hasn't exactly been years that Rob has been tracking him, but you know. Now, when it comes to the teenage characters in this movie, they are fairly likable, but I will say, this is probably the horniest Friday the 13th movie, which is not actually saying much. Because basically, all the teenage characters in this movie want to fuck each other, and there's a lot of nudity in this film, which I'm not gonna lie, seeing this movie for the first time when I was 12, yeah, I kinda liked that at that age. Now, I'm not gonna go through all the teenage characters in this movie, but probably the standouts would be Teddy and Jimbo, played by Lawrence Monoson and Crispin Glover. Crispin Glover, along with Corey Feldman, would probably go on to have the most successful career out of the actors in this movie. But Teddy and Jimbo kind of steal a lot of this movie with some of their banter, and Teddy constantly calling Jimbo a dead fuck because of his crappy luck with women. Meanwhile, Teddy doesn't seem to have a lot of luck with women either. Like, Teddy comes off as one of those guys who acts like he knows how to get a girl and knows what women want. Meanwhile, he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. Like, Teddy is simultaneously an awful character and an awesome character at the same time. You also have the character of Samantha, played by Julie Aronson, and the reason I'm bringing her up is I had actually met her this past Labor Day weekend at the drive-in theater where I saw this movie. She was doing some sign-ins. And she was very nice, and she actually signed this picture for me saying, "Screw you, Christian." If you saw the movie, yeah, that makes sense. Another character I want to bring up is Sarah, played by Barbara Howard, because the movie almost builds her up like she's gonna be the final girl, but nope, she gets killed off pretty horrifically towards the end of this film, kind of showing you that anybody can die, like Jason kills indiscriminately. And then you have stuntman Ted White as Jason, who I think does a great job. Now, I know Ted White was not a fan of these movies and actually requested that his name be taken off the film or that he goes uncredited. And despite not taking it seriously at all, I do think Ted White is probably one of the best Jasons, at least next to Kane Hodder. And you also have Tom Savini doing the makeup and special effects in this movie. He also did the effects work for the first Friday the 13th, and basically because he helped co-create Jason, they kind of wanted to bring him back to kill Jason off, because again, this was meant to be the final film in the series. Tom Savini even said it felt like almost a Frankenstein moment for him, like Jason was almost his Frankenstein monster in a way. But the makeup effects is quite good in this movie. Now, you do see Jason unmasked at the end of the film, and he does look radically different than when he was unmasked at the end of the last two movies, which is a bit of a continuity error considering this is only set a few days after the events of Friday the 13th Part 2 and 3. But I'm willing to forgive that, I really am. Now, I want to point out that this was the first movie where you found out that Jason's mother's name was Pamela because she was only called Mrs. Voorhees in the first movie. But you see her headstone at one point in the film, and actually her headstone kind of creates a bit of a timeline discrepancy because the date of her death says 1979, implying that the first Friday the 13th was set in 1979, which I would be fine with, except in the beginning of the first movie, they say Friday, June 13th, and June 13th didn't land on a Friday in 1979, it landed on a Friday in 1980. Now, I understand in reality it was probably a genuine mistake on the filmmakers' part, or maybe the filmmakers weren't really thinking that deeply about it, but because I'm a nerd, I'm gonna try to come up with sort of an in-universe explanation for why her headstone says 1979. So what I'm thinking is maybe whoever made Pamela's headstone genuinely fucked up the date, or maybe it's an implication that these movies are actually taking place in sort of an alternate universe, and perhaps in the Friday the 13th universe, June 13th landed on a Friday in 79 instead of 80. And yes, I know, I should probably get a life. A fun little factoid about this movie, the same house where they shot all the Jarvis scenes, like the Jarvis house, the same house was later used for Pumpkinhead. But yeah, Friday the 13th, the final chapter, I think is a very good slasher film, and a really good addition to this series, and if this were the final film in the franchise, I think it would have been a decent conclusion. Like, none of these films necessarily had the deepest story by any means, but I think this one did a good job at wrapping up what was established in the first three films. Now, the movie, much like the first three films, was a huge hit at the box office, despite not faring well with critics at all, especially with Siskel and Ebert. In fact, Roger Ebert's review of this movie is kind of notorious. Like, he tears the movie a new asshole, but if you see his rant on this film, he honestly acts like the filmmakers killed his family or something. Like, it's kind of ridiculous, but kind of hilarious at the same time. In fact, it was Roger Ebert's rant on Friday the 13th, the final chapter, that in the age of the internet, inspired Brad Jones to create the character of the cinema snob. Now, because this movie was such a huge hit, it prompted Paramount to make more sequels, and in fact, the next two Friday the 13th movies that came right after this, Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, and Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, both feature Tommy Jarvis as the main character. Now, in both those movies, Tommy was played by different actors because both of those films portray older versions of the character, and fans now consider Parts 4, 5, and 6 to be the Tommy Jarvis trilogy. Tommy Jarvis also appeared in the Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash comics, and he's also a playable character in that Friday the 13th video game from a few years ago. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to my late friend Chris Mano giving his thoughts on Friday the 13th, the final chapter. This was taken from the retrospective we did on the Friday the 13th franchise back in 2018.
This one is, I think, a lot of people's favorites because you got Crispin Glover, who's just like insane in everything he does. I think it was Adam Green that said this one had the most distinct like group of teenagers, and I think he's probably right because they all stand out really well and they all feel like it feels shitty when they get killed off because we are like invested in them. It's not like a usual slasher film where we're just waiting for people to die. And then obviously the introduction of Tommy. who was like a godsend to a lot of horror fans because he was this like big horror nerd and like he made like masks and stuff. And his arc across the next 3 movies is really significant, particularly if you're somebody who is interested in like horror heroes and that kind of thing. So this kind of launches that whole arc, and it's awesome. And I love the ending when he's just like stabbing Jason endlessly. It's really fun to watch.
Here are Joey's thoughts on the final chapter.
Hello again. I'd like to do some take on the Friday the 13th Part 4 this time. It's another one of my real favorite movies in the series. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are actually my 4 favorites out of the whole series because it's like the classics, and it's that's what I like about it, because I like the movies from the 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, so the classic. That's why I like 1 through 4. And Part 4 was supposed to be actually the last one, but what happened is they decided to go further with it, but that was really going to be the final one. It stars Camilla Moore, and her sister's in it too. They're actually twins. I met them before at a convention. I really like special effects because the computers now are okay, but to me, I really like the effects the best from the 80s. And this movie with Part 4 really had a lot of good effects in it because I seen how they did it. And but that's what I like about the effects. It really makes it more realistic and stuff because it's like it's something really there, versus the computer. And also stars Corey Feldman. But yeah, this is really a cool movie too. To me, it's one of my favorites in the series. It's really cool movie.
And here are my friends John and Jeremy giving their thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 4.
Here are my thoughts on Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. This was originally intended to be the final Friday movie, but we as an audience are smart enough to not fall for that. Despite, as I said before, not being a big diehard fan of the Friday the 13th series, this is one of the good sequels and one of my favorites of the series, with the opening recap of the last movies in Part 3, where Jason was taken to a morgue. The opening, we see a guy watching an exercise videotape called Aerobicize, which is really an 80s exercise videotape, but honestly it looked like a porn movie, even though it was not porn. I guess this turned him on for sex. As usual, he's a jerk to the girl, and of course, Jason kills the nurse. These characters have little personality, a little bit more of an arc compared to the last movie. In the last movie, the characters were forgetful for me. This movie had some unknown actors who would later become teen icons of the 80s. Crispin Clover, this movie came out first, and 1 year later he was in Back to the Future where he played George McFly, Marty McFly's father. He's basically the kind of character that you root for to get laid after getting dumped by his ex-girlfriend when he's heartbroken. It's fun when he asks the girl to dance, and his dance is a little funny, he's rocking it out. He was trying too hard to impress the twin girl he has a crush on. I met Judie Aronson last October in 2022. She signed me a picture autograph saying, "Kiss me, you fool." I'm not gonna lie, not to get off topic, when I first saw this movie as a teenager, part of me had a little crush on her. She was nice and sweet to talk to. To me, she's one of my favorite Friday girls, even though she's not the final girl in the movie. Also, I will say, she still looks beautiful today. She was in John Hughes' 1980s teen comedy Weird Science 1 year later. Also, when I met Judie Aronson, I said to her, sorry for the loss of Ted White, because around this time period, Ted White had passed away when I met her. There was a love triangle between her boyfriend and one of the twin sisters. When I first read about the movie's production, how when they shot Judie Aronson's death scene, it was shot in the wintertime, she felt so cold developing hypothermia. It was hard for her to do the kill scene in the cold. The director was such a jerk to her. Ted White, he almost quit the movie because of the director's behavior towards her. Lawrence Monsoon prior to this was in The Last American Virgin, which I've never seen before. This guy always gets high all the time. He's the only character in the movie that did not get laid in this movie. Tom Savini's back doing the special effects again, which is awesome and great. But sadly, the MPAA forced the editors to cut out the gross-out special effect kills. You can watch them on the Blu-ray. It stinks how they had to cut the gore out of this movie, because it shows how very talented of a guy he really is, Tom Savini. Corey Feldman does a good job as Tommy Jarvis. He's just your basic average ordinary kid who seems to have a talent and loves making monster masks. I wasn't talented doing this, but as a kid, I did have a fascination with horror masks. I still do to some degree to this day. It's a little funny when he's chasing his dog, and he sees the teen skinny dipping by the lake, then his older sister tells him to look away. Out of all the Friday movies, this one probably has the most nudity in it. I grew up watching Corey Feldman on The Goonies and Stand By Me. I never knew this was one of his early movies before his big breakout in the 80s, being an 80s icon. Also, I loved him in The Lost Boys too. This was the first time a kid had been one of the main characters in a Friday the 13th movie. Ted White does a good job as Jason, one of my favorite Jason actors. He was very dark and brutal. Ted White had a great career as a stuntman. He was on an X-Files episode as a gas station man. When I watched interviews of him on the Blu-ray, Ted White said he did not like working with Corey Feldman, thinking he was a spoiled brat. In a weird way, he said it worked for him to make the movie more effective in his performance as Jason Voorhees. The real highlight of this movie is when Jason fights Tommy Jarvis. When Tommy shaves his head off to look like Jason when he was a kid, then he attacks and kills Jason like a crazy child psycho murderer. It's very grotesque to see Jason's head get slit. Despite what I said before, the MPA cut out a lot of the kill gore scenes, and yet they kept this part in for some reason in the movie. The MPA have no idea what they want, are just a bunch of morons. It ends on a cliffhanger note where Tommy looks at the camera where he might be the new killer. If this is the last one, it could have been a good finale to the series. But again, we all know that turns out, if it makes money, they push it to the limit to make more sequels.
Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, is probably my favorite in the series because it's got a great cast, some great kills, and is really creepy. The story picks up right where Part 3 left off, with Jason's body being taken away from the site of those grisly murders to a morgue. From there, he escapes and goes on yet another killing spree. Kimberly Beck, who I've met, stars as the final girl Trish Jarvis, while Corey Feldman plays her younger brother Tommy. Tommy could best be described as a monster kid since he's always making all these really cool monster masks. I remember hearing somewhere that he was based on Tom Savini. You also have Erich Anderson as Rob, who is the brother of Sandra from Part 2. He's on the hunt for Jason in order to avenge his sister's death. The movie also marked an early appearance from Crispin Glover, who would go on to be a very well-known actor. He plays Jimmy, who's very awkward, but still a nice guy. I met Crispin Glover twice and talked to him about this movie. He told me that when they filmed his death scene, Ted White told him to scream really loud, but that he didn't think that someone would be able to scream with a machete in their face, so he didn't do it. He also described how his death scene was filmed, and I also asked him if Ted White really stayed away from the cast in order to make them more afraid of him, but Crispin didn't think that he did that. And speaking of Ted White, he does an amazing job as Jason. The way he moves is just so perfectly aggressive and fierce. Like Betsy Palmer with Pamela Voorhees, he didn't really want to take the role of Jason and only did it for the money, but nevertheless, he did the best job he could with the role. Unfortunately, he clashed frequently with director Joseph Zito, especially when it came time to film Judie Aronson's death scene. Judie Aronson had to spend hours in freezing cold water, and Joseph Zito wouldn't let her out. Ted White threatened to quit the movie if he didn't let her out to warm up, so Joseph Zito gave in to his demands. I've had the pleasure of meeting Ted White twice, and he was always very nice both times. He told me that playing Jason wasn't something he wanted to do at first, but that ultimately he was very glad he did it. He also told me that Corey Feldman was a mean little kid. I've gotten a lot of stuff signed by Ted White over the years. I've gotten photos, posters, and even an action figure signed by him. He was a very accomplished stuntman, having doubled for actors like Clark Gable and John Wayne, so he brought a lot of experience with him to the set. Judie Aronson is also very good as Samantha, and I had the pleasure of meeting her recently at Chiller Theater. This movie definitely gives you the amount of gore you'd expect when you go to a slasher film, which is a lot, and the familiar Friday the 13th theme music is great too. I also love the look of Jason when he's unmasked in this movie. The makeup done by Tom Savini is very scary, and it took 4.5 hours to do. Jason's death in this movie is also very well done. I especially like the shot of his head falling onto the machete. The movie did well at the box office, but of course critics didn't like it, with Roger Ebert calling it an immoral and reprehensible piece of trash. Still, it's very well regarded among Friday the 13th fans and among horror fans in general. All in all, this is a great entry in the series, and I highly recommend it for anyone who's a horror fan.
So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. That was my review of Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, and my next movie review will be on Friday the 13th, A New Beginning.